Terrific. First off, welcome everybody. My name's Eric Brown. I work here at Hudson Institute. I'm delighted that all of you could come here for what I think will be a very interesting discussion on what is, I think, the most interesting set of relations in all of Asia, frankly, and potentially one of the most strategically consequential relationships in the 21st century. That is the China-Pakistan relationship. I am sorry to report that Hussein Haqqani, our colleague here at Hudson Institute, has bogged down in Chicago in O'Hare Airport because of some bad weather there. So I don't think he's going to be able to join us for this panel. He may swoop in the last minute, and if we have some space for him, I'd love to solicit some of his ideas. But fortunately, my colleague and friend Aparna Pande, the director of Hudson's South Asia initiative, has agreed to sit in and to offer some remarks off the cuff on what this very important China-Pakistan relationship means from the perspective of India. And so I'm grateful for Aparna for filling in for Hussein. China's One Belt, One Road plan, as everybody knows, has rightly received worldwide attention as one of the most ambitious infrastructure project plans in all of history. As it is envisioned, it will place China at the center of an expanding network of new overland and sea routes that will connect East Asia, including China itself, but also the Pacific Rim countries of the Northeast and Indochina, with West Asia eventually, and also with Europe, and one day as well Africa. If it is realized, the so-called 21st century Silk Road could one day connect 63 countries, and through this it will come to transform how 2/3 of the world's humanity interacts politically and economically. This will, to put it mildly, have far-reaching geopolitical implications for the world, for the deep structure of power across Eurasia, and for American interests and American security policy on both sides of the Eurasian world island, both in the Pacific as well as in the Persian Gulf, and also, I think, increasingly as well in Europe. Already here in the US and in Delhi, in Japan and elsewhere around the world, people are scrambling to make sense of what all these new developments mean for their own national development policies and for their own security going forward. In Pakistan, as we know, the country's leaders there are used to conceiving of their country as being the pivot of the world. And in many respects, over the course of the last 50, 60 years, they have, in fact, played a very pivotal role in some of the great geopolitical competitions and churnings that have defined intra-Asian relations. I think in very significant ways, Pakistan is the pivot of the world once again. It's where the rising Chinese power is increasingly involving itself in West Asia, in the Middle East, and it's this relationship which, if consummated, has real broad, far-reaching implications for the Persian Gulf as well as for the Pacific Rim. China says it will invest upwards of $46 billion in developing mega projects in Pakistan. This includes roads, railways, pipelines, and other kinds of infrastructure, which is designed to create, if you will, not just a road connecting China to the Arabian Gulf, but also infrastructure which will create a self-sustaining economy in Pakistan itself. And it's the expectation that this investment in Pakistan will in time alleviate and ameliorate some of the poverty in Pakistan and some of the ethnic faction and religious unrest that we're seeing in Pakistan that is certainly very appealing to ordinary people in Pakistan, and certainly has been useful for Pakistan's politicians in selling this Chinese involvement in their country over the long run. To put this into perspective, this $46 billion that China has said it will bring online is roughly 3 times the amount of FDI that's come into Pakistan since 2008. And also since 9/11, I think it was tallied up that the United States has provided roughly $14 billion worth of security assistance to Pakistan. So again, this Chinese economic development dwarfs most of what is going into Pakistan right now. And through this investment, I think it's very likely that China seeks to acquire influence in Islamabad as well as in Rawalpindi. Up until relatively recently, the so-called rise of China was largely conceived as being primarily a maritime or an oceans-oriented phenomenon. In the first 30 years of its existence, the People's Republic of China, despite Mao Zedong's modern radicalism, had in a way attempted to replicate some of the empire-building strategies of previous Chinese dynasties. They sought to create an autarky and largely a land-based economy that was self-sustaining and able to sustain itself on its own terms and through its own domestic industry and resources. This proved to be very difficult to do historically, and under modern conditions it proved to be an impossibility. And therefore, after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, the Communist Party abruptly shifted both its internal economic arrangements and its international alliances toward the sea. It entered the global commercial and financial system and was supported in this by the US and also by other maritime nations, including Japan. Together, these created the most benign security environment that I think China and any Chinese-based polity has seen over the last 200 years. And it was through China's deepening interaction with this benign security and commercial environment that the so-called rise of China was launched. I think future historians, however, will look back at 2008 and more recent times and see that we've reached a new inflection point in China's rise. The worldwide financial crisis of 2008 and the consequential rolling economic and political crisis in China itself has once again started, if you will, a reappraisal for the ruling party in China about how best to pursue its rise. And for the party itself, the question is, what is the best strategy for maintaining its monopoly on power in China? We've seen since then, just over the last decade, a real reappraisal of China's grand strategy and a recentering, if you will, of China's grand strategy, where various factions in the government, businesses, and elsewhere have increasingly said China should no longer simply pursue its rise at sea, but also it should deepen and put greater emphasis on building out new kinds of connections with the Eurasian landmass on the continent. There are, I think, a number of different reasons which are driving this. People have leapt to ascribe various geopolitical ambitions to these new developments. There are clearly also domestic factors at play. In China, it's very difficult to look at any kind of external conduct of the Chinese regime without looking too at what the actual domestic sources of that conduct are. But it's also clear that I don't think that this is going to end anytime soon, and that we're likely going to see much, much greater involvement on the Eurasian landmass by China in the years ahead. The ruling factions in both Pakistan and in China have looked at this, I think, as an opportunity to solidify a strategic partnership, but also to further their own politics domestically. And I think we're going to see some very interesting consequences from this in parts of China wherein the PRC is attempting to establish much, much more control, such as Tibet and in Xinjiang. But we're also seeing, along with the announcement of China's investment in Pakistan, an effort by the Pakistani army to raise a force to bring Pakistani state power deeper into parts of Pakistan where it hasn't existed before. And by that I mean Baluchistan and parts of Gilgit-Baltistan, which abut Xinjiang and other places. As I mentioned, all of this is beginning to change the way in which different countries of Eurasia think about their development strategies and their security strategies going forward. All of this is quite new, And we're here to explore some of the implications of this over the coming years. We have an all-Hudson panel here, but I think that our speakers represent a diversity of perspectives on this very complex set of relations. I'd like to begin with Charles Horner, who is a sinologist by training and author of some books and articles on China, as well as a book, a soon-to-released book, which is the second volume of a series, Rising China's Postmodern Fate. Charles.
Well, thank you, and thank all of you for coming, and it's always nice to be here on the team of Hudson. Hudson All-Stars are all Hudson team. A few years ago, actually, mostly Eric, but I will say Eric and I decided we would invent a new field of inquiry, which we called Sinic-Islamic relations. And the idea here was to understand, if I may use some academic lingo, the interaction between the Islamic world and the Chinese world in many different ways. Intellectual, political, economic, and so on. And as we began this, we noticed that PRC as a state interacted with all kinds of predominantly Islamic societies in many different places. But the one thing they had in common from PRC's point of view was that if PRC were ever to emerge as the great power, if not of its own dreams, then at least of its cheerleaders, it was going to have to figure out how to manage these relationships, and they're all very different. Some of them, as Eric said, are maritime. Indonesia, for example, is a Muslim country in which China has a relationship with the people who ethnically dominate the economy, and so is Malaysia, and so is Bangladesh, and so is all the countries of Central Asia, all nearby. A reminder of the extraordinary diversity of the Islamic world, and a reminder that we always need to remind ourselves in this business that among all of the Muslims in the world, the Arabs are, well, probably smaller than 1/4. So as we began to think about this, then the idea was to use some more academic lingo to locate Sinic-Islamic relations in what we called a kind of world setting, and the relationship among the various parts and how they work. We were reminded of this morning when in the midst of the latest let's say, crisis involving ISIS and Europe and the United States, the President of the United States actually left and went to Manila. And so the question would be, how are these things related? And they are related in some ways, I think, in the PRC strategic mind. So it's important to look upon this in a world, in a world context, that what happens in one place is connected to other places, and it's a kind of shifting picture, kind of kaleidoscopic in that sense. Now, the other thing that we got interested in as we began to think about this some more was what we call the Continental versus the Maritime view of things that Eric referred to. And we gave it a fancy academic term of the Continental Maritime Dialectic. You all know what dialectic is. If you're an undergraduate in American college of my age, you could not escape understanding what that is. And our first sort of, well, I'll say sort of basic approach to it is how you're going to organize your great empire. You all remember Harold Mackinder, who wrote about he who dominates the heartland will control the world, and published this. And this point of view, by the way, fell into real disquietude because everyone was reading the works of Alfred Thayer Mahan, as Eric mentions. He who creates a kind of naval force of a certain kind will run the world. And then we were drawn to the example of, let's call it Rising Japan, the rise of Japan, Imperial Japan, where both of these visions of the future of the country, how to secure the realm, how to secure the, existed, came into conflict, and the conflict was never resolved. And some of you may remember that on the one hand, the Japanese could not decide whether to concentrate their efforts on the mainland of Asia or to fight the maritime powers in the Pacific, and so decided to fight both and lost in both places. So we thought, well, maybe there's a lesson in this somewhere that our friends are in Beijing are paying attention to. Now, I myself like to borrow from the discussion of someone named William Callahan, who teaches at the London School of Economics, who's written about the vision that informs the grand Chinese view of things, but in very interesting ways. And the question is, what does the world look like? What is the order of the world order? And lately there has been reappearing in the past several years in the Chinese, and let's use another academic term about this, shall we, discourse on these subjects, a language, a vocabulary, a discourse, if you will, which he calls Sinospeak. And Sinospeak is a way of talking about the world in traditional Chinese categories of power and hierarchy and organization and empire, with the traditional view of the Lianchao all under heaven and the emperor and his munificence radiating outward from his court, as against what he calls Rim speak. The Rim speak is sort of Asia Rim, Pacific Century speak. And the conflict between these two things, these two vocabularies and ways of imagining the world. In the first volume of the book that I wrote, that Eric mentions, there's a lot of stuff about oceans focus and how we're going to reinvent area studies all over the world and give it an oceans focus, and how all the cities of the world, you remember Pacific Rim, Los Angeles and Vancouver and Tokyo and where am I leaving out, Chile. And so the ocean, Pacific Ocean is going to be it. All these people are going to have a gigantic sort of version of the Hanseatic League, and we're going to have, quote, the Pacific Century, and we're going to speak Pacific Century speak or Rim speak. And as Eric says, well, there's less and less of that kind of speak going on, even among us native speakers of this language, let alone the people who have adopted it. And so it is a sense that we're in a transitional period where we begin to imagine now the let's call it the pre-maritime view of what a great global empire looks like. Pre-1500 view, pre-sea power view. A most startling development, you all remember when the Portuguese arrived in the small ships and transformed the entire economic and political and strategic structure of the world, and people kind of thought that these places in Central Asia were left to die on the vine, and would be. Die on the vine forever. Now there's an odd confluence both of a crisis of confidence, plus the domestic requirements of the Chinese Communist Party to perpetuate its rule, plus the pressures of a certain kind of Sunni Islamic relationship, plus a necessity really for PRC to become more involved in, from its point of view, the farther Near East rather than the closer Near East, involvements in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in places like this, and seems to be some controversy by our own Dr. Ben Carson as to whether or not the Chinese are in Syria, but it doesn't matter from the point of view of this kind of discussion. They're probably a few there. So from this point of view, it's interesting to look at the One Belt, One Road strategy and the enormous amounts of money that are being invested in it, at least by announcement, and compare that with what are other forms of investment that are going on in China. Well, there seem to be two others that we can detect. The single most important is, of course, the enormous growth in the development of the internal security forces to keep order, especially in Muslim Xinjiang, which is now under a kind of lockdown, and there may be, by some effort, more than 1 million armed men representing PRC in Xinjiang of all different kinds, and reports of violence. The second is this enormous, remember, 46 billion for Pakistan and untold billions for the Asia Infrastructure Bank. Lots of commitments of money as against what's being spent on developing the Chinese Navy, which is a lot of money, and which is the kind of thing that we in the West notice most because it's the kind of thing that is most conspicuous for us. But the question is, does that really represent the long-term vision of the people who are in charge in PRC at the moment? Now, finally, I just say this is a way of trying to understand this relationship that's developing between China and Pakistan, aside from the question of neither of them much likes India, which seems to me is nothing, which is an important aspect of it. To what extent it is part of a larger strategy of involvement in the Islamic world, extension of Chinese influence out of necessity into a farther Near East where the structures of states, the old state structure is crumbling. The Western powers are receding, and they still are, aside from the 20 bombs that the French Air Force has recently dropped on Raqqa. And how China then imagines itself in this new configuration, and whether or not it really has to be a giant maritime power in order to do it, or whether it can reach this area, as Eric suggests, by imagining corridors through Pakistan and corridors through other places also, through Kazakhstan, to take it to what, after all, is one of the core strategic regions of the world. And so we are planning, I think, in future to look at this relationship, especially between China and Pakistan, as what it may portend, not merely for the future of Chinese calculation, but what it may, about this whole desire on the part of China to link itself to the Islamic world, either by land or by sea, or also by land and by sea, and what this means for the maritime powers such as the United States and, to an extent, India and Japan. And I'll just say one other thing about this. I haven't gone on too long about it. One thing we need to think about now, especially in the U.S., is the role of the maritime, the four maritime powers, or the three who are in the Pacific right now, how they should evaluate the meaning of this greater activity in Central and Southwest Asia on the part of PRC. What it means to us, how we should respond to it, whether or not we should, as we say, get busier in that part of the world or not. Prime Minister Abe was recently there, took a tour of the stands, promised a lot of money, understanding that in some way the future of Japan and its security is implicated in what goes on in that part of the world. And on that point, I'll stop. And
thank you. That was terrific. Thanks, Charles. Next, I wanted to ask Lianchao Han if he would be happy to speak. Lianchao is a fellow here at the Institute, a former Senate staffer as well, a sociologist, political scientist by training, also the vice president of a group called Initiatives for China, which is working to foster peaceful and democratic futures for China. Lianchao.
Thank you. As the most critical component of China's new Silk Road initiative, the 46 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor symbolize a beginning of China's strategic shift. But why is China doing this? More importantly, where this CPEC will lead China to world dominance, self-destruction, or nowhere. So I'm gonna focus my talk on what the Chinese have to say about it, and what is my own assessment. Most Chinese strongly support CPEC, and some of the strategic thinkers, scholars even believe that this is the greatest strategic opportunity. Once in a 1,000-year opportunity for China to regain the world dominance. It is not surprising because in the past 30 years that China's foreign aid policy changed a little bit, more focused on practical side, more deliberate, more practical, focus more on the return of capital investment. But essentially, this is still a top-down decision-making mechanism. So since Xi Jinping, the chairman of everything, took power, the decision-making mechanism become even more top-down and more rushed, far less predictable. Xi Jinping has already decided, go ahead with the CPEC. Anybody that expressing different view will likely to be found guilty of improperly, discussing openly opposing government policy. Xinjiang Daily chief editor is the example of that crime. But I think the support is almost one-sided because of the government, because Xi Jinping's decision. So most people would argue, most supporters would argue that this CPEC will allow China to counter, would be the best way for China to counter the U.S. pivot to Asia, and without a head-to-head confrontation. They believe that U.S. through the rebalance policy, the TPP, they try to encircle China. But CPEC will enable China to move into Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa. So by doing so, break the U.S. incurment of China, and allow them to strike the U.S. at its weakest point, where the U.S. power influence fading away fast, and so get an uphand over the U.S. A very typical Chinese communist strategy, using the rural areas to encircle the city. By the new gained land power, they can offset their sea power and resolve the Malacca dilemma, so to speak, securing their energy route. And thus, if they believe they control the region, they will control the world. And at the same time, I think they also believe that this CPEC will effectively contain their common enemy, Pakistan, China's common enemy, rival, I would say, India, and also help China secure its border, the Xinjiang, the Muslim region, and by eliminating Uyghur Uyghur terrorist threat once and for all. And I think another important argument they made is that this CPEC will continue to help China to expand economically, and that find a new market for China's overproduction capacity, and also get a better return of China's piling up 4 trillion foreign reserve. And meantime, they will help China create a booming economy in the Chinese Western area. And in addition to that, they will provide strategic materials for China to sustain long-term growth. And of course, one important component is they trust Pakistan as all-weather friend that can protect and guarantee their investment. and that's why the one-sided support for CPEC is pretty overwhelming. But there are some opposing views in China. Even it's very small, but still can be heard. I was told actually within the system there are lots of people strongly opposing such an investment, but in public you won't see any, like a publication. Not very many articles you can find on internet. But the opposing view basically saying that this is a rush of Xi Jinping's rush of blood to the head decision. The projects, many of the projects, they are not well studied, evaluated. There's no review and audit mechanism, and no open bidding process in place. So many of these, many of these projects will be, be wasted. And they also think that it doesn't make any economic sense because building that railroad, pipeline, and highway is going to be extremely difficult to build and to maintain. Because we know the Karakoram highway they only use for half a year. And because of the weather, the high altitude, they can't use the whole year round. Even with the expanded highway, I doubt they're going to keep it open all year. And last time they had this landslide and blocked the highway, the KKH, for almost 5 years. And that's and then the premise of Malacca dilemma is also false, because if U.S. they were thinking, because 6% of China's oil transported through Malacca Strait, the argument for the project says, by going that way we can avoid American blocking the Malacca Strait. But the opposing view says, if America can block Malacca, they can easily block Hormuz Strait as well as Qatar port. So it doesn't make any sense to just simply do it that way. And then there's also another concern that because of Pakistan's political instability, the internal conflicts and regional tension, terrorists, separatist movement, that this kind of large investment could become the Nashahara loan. Nashahara loan is a Japanese loan, a large sum of Japanese loan, lent to Chinese Beiyang warlord Duan Qizhui government in 1970. And then when the new government formed in 1925, they refused to recognize that loan. And that default loan became one of the reasons that triggered the Japanese and Chinese war. And then there's also argument, the opposing side says that, by building this corridor, you're going to enable more Muslims enter into Xinjiang region that create even bigger security problem for China. So my own view is this. I think this is China's one stone, many birds strategy to create a China-led or China-dominated new international relations and a new world order. But because of China's paranoia about their region security, they kind of rushed to make that decision, not as rational as they should be, more based on the geopolitical calculation than on sound economic principle. And then this road more likely lead China to nowhere. That's my assessment, because at least it won't go anywhere for a long while, because I don't think that both sides are ready for that. Pakistan's political instability, regional tension, racial tension, cultural and social problem, anyone can stop this, can derail this project. For example, in April, when Xi Jinping was in Pakistan, officially signing 51 MOUs and officially launched this project. And then a month later, in May, Pakistan all-party conferences finally agreed to support it. You see that gap between the official launching the project and finally Pakistanis come out supporting it? So, and also I want to point out China's own great Western development program, which officially launched 15 years ago, offered a very good reference point. Mm-hmm. Because lots of money invested, lots of roads built, lots of power plant built, and other infrastructure built. But so far, does not generate a booming economy. It failed to generate that economy. So I think the unlike traditional foreign aid to Pakistan, this time the investment, it's an investment, not aid. China demand a higher return of their capitals. They want Pakistani government to guarantee that. And for example, there's a solar project near Karachi, which is about the capital cost is about $760 million. After all the 7% fee, servicing fee, debt service fee, and other financial stuff, and also construction interests, all added up, they have to pay, Pakistani has to pay $950 million. So the interest rate during the construction will be as high as 33%.
Yeah.
So such of the investment will certainly create conflicts, create resentment from Pakistani people. And then at the same time, China, I don't think China can rely on their Iron Brothers' words to protect their interests, because they had to suck into Pakistani, their household internal affairs, politics. And this is, of course, a very dangerous entanglement, as history can tell us. And I think there's a much better way for China to help Pakistan. China's own successful economic development in the early 80s offer much better model, because you don't build infrastructure. You use the liberalization, deregulation, create a better environment for the investors come into your place, like Taiwan, business people from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, from United States, that bring factories, bring jobs, bring technologies, bring capital, bring management skill, training, create a viable economy. And after that happens, the infrastructure that needed will follow. So it's much better way than building this corridor. And that the party still, even the whole party conference endorsed the plan, but their fight for the routes, which way to go, and the projects along the corridor never resolved. So I'm going to end my talk by using this Shakespeare's warning. Neither a borrower nor a lender for long oft loses itself and friend. So when China tied their future to this very risky and dangerous, unstable part of the world, they are most likely going to lose their shirt in this gamble. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Pande.
Eric, thank you, and wonderful to be on this All Hudson panel. I'll speak a little bit about India and New Delhi and how does New Delhi look at the Sino-Pak relationship. On the one hand, if Pakistan stabilizes and you have a democratic, economically stable Pakistan, that would be ideal for India. However, there are things that Delhi fears. First, Delhi is concerned that China's overall, the One Belt, One Road initiative is not benign, not only in Pakistan, but with other neighbors of India. China has invested and is building infrastructure in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, even Nepal, and further into Myanmar. So that is the first part of New Delhi is concerned. Secondly, Delhi has been concerned about the Sino-Pak relationship for a long time now. The relationship dates back to 1950. Pakistan was the first Muslim and first Muslim country to acknowledge communist China. And so Chinese economic aid, investment has been coming in from 1950 onwards. However, the relationship has been very strong in the defense and nuclear arena, and that has concerned Delhi predominantly. There's something which Charles said, which reminded me of how Pakistani theorists and analysts look at China. Mackinder. They actually believe, Pakistani analysts believe that Pakistan is the pivot of the world, and that draws from the rimland, heartland. That Pakistan is in the rimland area, and but that Pakistan is important. And so the belief that not just United States, but that China would be interested in investing in Pakistan is something which is very old, dates back to 1950s and 1960s. But coming back to something that both Eric and Lianchao said, New Delhi's concerns are primarily that it's not going to be a economically stable Pakistan which will result from CPEC. It will be a Pakistan which has more, or let's say more defense relationship with, or a deeper defense relationship with China, has a bigger conventional military, and has more nuclear reactors and more nuclear material, and that makes the entire region, especially the India-Pakistan relationship, even more unstable than it currently is. I'll stop there and leave the rest for questions.
I just mentioned one thing quickly. Owen Lattimore, who was the very well-known and at one point politically controversial great American authority on Inner Asia, wrote a book called Xinjiang, Pivot of Asia, you see, and therefore of the world. So depending on what your, the focus is of your grant application, that
we all pivot
can turn it into the you turn it into the pivot of the world, and no problem there. So.
Yeah, terrific. I'm curious. I wanted to ask Aparna and perhaps Lianchao if they could speculate a little bit about what the possibility or the prospect of greater Chinese investment and involvement in Pakistan might mean for Pakistan's internal political development. I asked this in part because I recall, I guess it was the late 2008 when I was in Islamabad and spoke to a retired Pakistani Corps commander. We were speaking about Baluchistan as well as the looming energy crisis that Pakistan was suffering from at the time, and which has only gotten worse. And the commander said to me that the Pakistani army, that the discipline in the ranks was beginning to break down at the time, because it was increasingly more difficult for officers to direct their soldiers to open fire on Baluch separatists. And that this was becoming a much, much more difficult strategic policy for the Punjabi elite in Pakistan to pursue, that is, bringing state power to Baluchistan going forward. For that reason, I was struck that when the CPEC deal was formally announced, it was also announced, Nawaz Sharif had said that Pakistan would raise a security force of upwards of 12,000 Pakistani security agents to help protect Chinese workers who would be building out this infrastructure into, among other places, Baluchistan and in other places. Now, of course, this security force would be green. It would be certainly not the same forces which the Pakistani Corps commander had told me about, that were losing discipline and losing desire to involve themselves in Baluchistan back in 2008. So my question is, I mean, even if the great Chinese road through Pakistan does not realize itself, and even if these investments do not amortize and bring returns back, the prospect of this investment still has implications for the internal balance of power between various Pakistani factions and within the government itself. I'm curious what you think the next few years might have in store for us as a consequence of this.
Just a few points, and then one is, as Lianchao mentioned, there's still a disagreement within Pakistan and Pakistani power centers on where exactly and which province will get more of the projects which are coming in. Mr. Sharif and as well as his brother in Lahore would like more of them coming to Punjab. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa would like more of the projects, and so there is still a disagreement which of the 4 Pakistani provinces, and in some ways it's Punjab versus the rest. Yeah. There's a belief that because Mr. Sharif's party dominates Punjab, And that's where most of the economy, most of the businesses, that Punjab may actually end up benefiting from CPEC. Second issue is that in Balochistan, by the port Gwadar, because I mean the ideal would be that everything should move towards Gwadar so that you land up on the Persian Gulf or the Gulf of Hormuz. However, the Baloch insurgents and Baloch are not in favor and have never been in favor of foreign investment coming in. They protested even when Gwadar port was being built by China many years ago, and they have continued their protest. Even they're still not agreed or accepted. That's the second problem which China is going to face in CPEC. Third, you mentioned in 2008. I was actually in Pakistan in July 2008 when the Red Mosque siege took place. And at that time, the Pakistan army was concerned both with the fact that there were people who were not very happy, I mean, within the army, that they were actually having to go against Islamists who for many decades had been seen as their allies. So not just the Baloch insurgents, it was going against people who were from Punjab or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and they were having rebellion in some of their regiments in the tribal areas. And in some cases, if you recall at that time, some of the soldiers were actually kidnapped by groups in the FATA region because the soldiers refused to fight those people. And finally, you mentioned the power problem. One of the problems, Pakistan has had an electricity problem power problem for almost 3 or 4 decades now, 1990s. Every Pakistan civilian government which comes in has tried to resolve it.
Yeah.
They tried to do it in the early 1990s. They actually got foreign investors who would come in and set up what is called independent power projects. The problem was in the 1990s, every 2 years, governments changed. And the succeeding government refused to recognize the previous government, the promises. And so no foreign company was willing to therefore go back in and lose as GE and others had done in the early 1990s. In the last 5-7 years, the civilian governments have again tried to bring in, but the problem is that you need to provide that stability and promise that any project which starts now will continue, and it will have both economic stability as well as government stability.
Right.
Lianchao.
Yeah, I think you're gonna see more regional tension in Pakistan to fight for the projects. And I think a few months ago, they have the poor province went to the parliament, demonstrate in front of the parliament. They hold a big banner, China-Pakistan friendship, no China-Punjab friendship.
Yeah.
So that sells.
Yeah.
So lots of the project goes to the prime minister's province.
Yeah.
So that will create lots of tension, and also I think the energy, even they build the projects because of the investment cost, the electricity is going to be more expensive than they used to pay. So that will also create some kind of resentment, in that country.
Yeah.
Charles, one thing about Lianchao's very interesting point about the relationship to all of this, to a policy initiative in PRC in the late 90s called Go West policy. And the idea was to build up the western part of the country and to deal with these awful problems of income inequality and so on. It turns out, I think, I don't know, but one suspects that the central government for a while had a very hard time bringing that part of Western, now China proper, to heal. You'll remember, those pay attention to these sorts of things, that back in, I guess it was 2013, there was a fellow named Bo Xilai who built up a great power base out in Sichuan province, which is the western part of the country. And he was brought down, and who knows how much of this is true, but it was a wonderfully lurid kind of tale where his wife poisoned her British lover, and he was guilty of all kind of corrupt, and so on and so forth. And then he was brought down. And it turns out, of course, reading between the lines of the current anti-corruption campaign, that all the people who were in, and must have been a very large plot, because it brought down the retired former minister of, man who ran the secret police, who had gotten to run the secret police because he had once run the National Oil Company and had built up an astonishing slush fund for paying off people, one assumes. And this whole anti-corruption thing is all the people who were involved somehow in some way, you know, lieutenant generals in the PLA in the Western Military Region taken down during all of this, which suggests even now there's a problem of bringing this, what we China-logs, you know, traditionally restive area under control. So I think that's another interesting perspective on all of this, is the use of this sort of thing somehow to develop greater political power for the new party central elite in this part of the country where it's been having its problems. And I do want to praise, just one thing, I do want to praise my colleague Lianchao for it. It's been a long time since I, China history major, heard the name of Duan Qirui and his sidekick, I saw Wu Pei Fu from the old Beiyang War. Let's see, the old Beiyang War. We used to have to know this stuff in the old China studies. In the new China studies, of course, we don't. But I appreciate that bit of sinological nostalgia there.
Terrific. Let's have some questions. Sir. There we go.
Thank you. David Isby. Conspicuous by its absence from all four very interesting statements is Afghanistan, the heart of Asia. In recent years, there has been thought in Kabul that China's policy towards Afghanistan is changing from basically backing up Pakistan's actions in that country to one which shows its own security concerns of Islamic terrorism and investment. What do you think this will actually be realized, or will China's interest in Afghanistan be primarily in supporting Pakistan in the future?
Lianchao or Charles, would you? Or?
You know, I'm trying to remember. It's just getting very fuzzy in my mind. But when we, Eric and I first got interested in this, the man who purported to be, mind you, Hu Jintao's principal advisor on Central Asian affairs, you remember this fellow, came through town and visited all of the think tanks and was telling us about how China was now prepared to play finally a very constructive role in Afghanistan, and had bought this great big copper mine and bribed everyone in Afghanistan in order to get it, and so on. So we're always hearing these stories about an act, and the problem for the U.S., of course, is sort of akin to, and I don't want to start any trouble here, but it's sort of akin to this problem now that, you know, with the Russians and ISIS. Well, we don't like the Russians, but maybe they'll help us with it. Now we don't like the Chinese. Do we want to build up their influence in Afghanistan to find some way for ourselves to get out? So this sort of thing seems to be going on all the time. I'll defer to people who actually know about all these intrigues in Pakistan.
Aparna, would you like to?
What has changed recently and happened is that China has actually come in on what are called the Taliban peace talks. So, I mean, what people believe is that China has managed to convince Pakistan, the Chinese investment in Pakistan, in lieu of that, Pakistan needs to help stabilize not only its own country but also Afghanistan. And so in the Taliban peace negotiations and talks, there are Chinese who are present. It's not just Americans, but Chinese, Pakistan, Afghan representatives and Taliban representatives. How much of an influence China is able to exert on Rawalpindi and how much influence Rawalpindi is able to exert on the Taliban representatives is still up in the air, primarily since we got to know only a few months ago that Mullah Omar was supposed to be alive for 2 years, actually passed away 2 years ago. And so his people who represented him didn't actually represent him. And so there's that thing there. But China has started to play an active role in Afghanistan. And I believe something which China would like a stable Afghanistan. But I'll leave China to Lianchao.
I think you're right. I totally agree. I think China it's in the best interest of China to stabilize Afghanistan, particularly after the U.S. totally withdrawal. And China, I think I heard they privately pay Taliban, to stay away from their poverty, their mines. But the factor of ISIS is unknown. It's uncertain. I think it's in China's best interest to join hands with the America, with other countries to eliminating the ISIS influence expansion in Afghanistan. But that is an unknown factor. I don't think China can control that at this point.
Yeah. Ma'am.
Hi, I'm Catherine Porter with the Leadership Council for Human Rights. Thank you. Wonderful presentation. I have a simple question, but it's probably the most complex question. I've been working very hard with the Baluch and the Sindh in Pakistan, trying to unify them. It seems to me that this coalition between China and Pakistan will be built on the bones of those people. We need to look at that much more hardly. And secondly, it's the U.S. funding of the ISI which is killing those same people. Why can't we bring some definition to what we get from Pakistan in terms of response? And I have been on the ground there extensively. So I would be interested in your reaction to that. Thank you.
Aparna?
I guess I'll take your second question first. Why hasn't US changed its policy in 55 years is something I don't know if anybody can actually answer, but if you look at the US archives, you see that every American administration coming in believes that it must do something and give more money in aid to Pakistan, and every president in his last year, up till now, he decides that no, it's not good and it's not going anywhere. But we'll have to wait for the next president to see if this cycle actually changes. Coming back to your first question, Pakistan, one of the things which both Lianchao and I pointed out is that one of the problems China is going to face in Pakistan is there is not just regional but ethnic. They're not just separatist movements, they're also the fact that all the ethnic linguistic groups in Pakistan, except for the Punjabis, actually believe that they have not been provided enough representation in any arena, whether it be military, academia, or otherwise. And so they do feel that they are neglected, they haven't got enough investment. Not just Chinese, even foreign investment doesn't come into these areas. There are human rights issues. But I think, I do believe that international agencies and the US government are talking about it, but it's something which will take a long time. And I hear you on what you said.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
Sure.
I think the U.S. lack of grand strategy towards Pakistan in the past, maybe 28 billion or 30 billion, the aid, military, humanitarian, that given to the Pakistan, but they don't focus on strengthen Pakistan's democracy, rule of law, respect to human rights. I think we don't have that strategy. How to do it. And without this grand strategy, you cannot stabilize Pakistan. And I think U.S. need to have a better strategy, strengthen the rule of law, strengthen the democracy system, and respect human rights. And then they can fundamentally stabilize Pakistan.
Yeah. I'll add that, the relationship between the U.S., as our colleague Hussein Haqqani has written in a fantastic book, has been based upon magnificent delusions that we've each told ourselves about the other, number one. I also tend to think that U.S.-Pakistan relations and U.S. policy toward Pakistan has not been driven by principles or any sense of a grand strategy, but really by the bureaucracies and by bureaucratic inertia. And now I think you're seeing in the United States a desire on both sides of the political spectrum to reorganize our policy towards South Asia as a whole, something that would bring about a sort of recentering, a shift away from Islamabad and Rawalpindi toward New Delhi. Whether that will open up an opportunity for much greater clarity about the real human rights abuses that are taking place in Pakistan or not, I don't know. I should hope that it does. My own view is precisely yours, that one of the areas of collusion, if you will, between certain elements of the Beijing regime and the one in Islamabad is that both of them see each other as co-conspirators, if you will, in facilitating their domination of their peripheries, of their ethnic peripheries. I tend to think that the possibility of federal stabilization in Pakistan, a political solution, if you will, to the problems that the Baluch face, to the problems that the Gilgit-Baltistanis face, and even to the problems that the Pashtun face, that possibility of a federal stabilization it becomes increasingly unlikely the more China's investment works its way into the country. I also tend to think that both elements in the Pakistani regime and in the Chinese regime want to build their relationship simply because they see their immediate purpose consolidating control, in China's case over Xinjiang and in Pakistan's case over Baluchistan. I think that really is the intermediary objective of this alliance.
Can I just add one quick point?
Yeah.
I think the reason we don't have that grand strategy because the folks very short-sighted on just get rid of the Taliban. But after so many years, the Taliban is still very popular there. So I think U.S. needs to review its strategy, how to deal with Pakistan. Really strengthen the democracy, rule of law,
Yeah.
to move forward.
Yeah.
Could I just comment on that? I am of Cherokee ancestry. Keith Harper, our new ambassador to United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva, is Cherokee. We've discussed extensively indigenous issues, as are the Baluch and many other people. He was, and I asked him to meet with some Baluch leaders. He was told by his boss that he couldn't do that because if we criticize Pakistan in any way, the UN would be forced to remove all of their projects on the ground. Now, somewhere we have to rethink our larger ability to work in the State Department and in the world. And I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, you can wait for a moment for the mic to make it to you.
Thank you. A couple quick comments. One, I think it's a mistake to say that we could create a grand strategy that will stabilize Pakistan. And just to offer an exception to Aparna's presidential compulsion to aid Pakistan, Bill Clinton entered office without that compulsion. They were under sanction at the time. But, I'm Alan Cronstadt from the Congressional Research Service. And I think I wanted to make a comment and ask a question, but the comment is mostly about conceptualizing this. And I was so happy that you emphasized that China is investing in Pakistan, that this is not a foreign aid program. And I think it's a big mistake to conceive of this as foreign assistance. Pakistan acts, with a lot of self-interest in this regard, and it's investment. And so, like, for instance, there's an implicit comparison between U.S. aid and Chinese investment that's promised. At the time that this CPEC was announced, there were headlines running about $46 billion from Pakistan or from China as opposed to roughly $30 billion from the U.S. That's really apples and oranges. You're talking about never mind that half the $30 billion is reimbursements for military support. But you're talking about $30 billion given to Pakistan, grants, versus $46 billion being talked about given to Pakistan in the future. And as Aparna mentioned, there's nothing new about Chinese investment in Pakistan. This rhetorical romance and commercial relationship has been going on for decades. So I think it's important to make that distinction. So the question I had, though, and it's kind of related, the Chinese Pakistani people-to-people relations seem very thinly developed, and you don't see Pakistanis buying homes in Shanghai and Beijing. You don't see parents sending their children to college in China. So I'm wondering to what extent that kind of limited people-to-people relationship fundamentally limits the kind of investment relationship or alliance that the two countries can have, despite all the sweet honey-laced rhetoric about their eternal friendship. Thanks.
Lianchao, you want to take a stab at that? Charles?
I think if you look at the media on the Chinese side and even the Pakistani side, you see lots of this romantic, view of all-weather friendship, iron brotherhood. But in fact, I think, as you said, the people-to-people exchange is not as that great. And China even don't have enough Pakistani scholars who study Pakistan. So China really don't understand the culture, the country. And I think in a deeper sense, Chinese usually look down on Pakistani people because they think they're backward. And also, if you look at the highway, KKH, most of this one-way trade, you don't see that from other side come to this way. So that type of relationship, and also you see when they build the projects, you always bring Chinese workers to work on the projects, even chef. They bring their own chefs.
Yeah.
In Africa, in there, but when China opened up before, you don't see Taiwanese bring their workers to work in Shenzhen. The old management, all technology. So that one-way kind of trade, I think, harmed the people-to-people exchange. But I would say China has since then put more emphasis on the study. They set up a language programs. In the past few years, and more people studied the Urdu, and lots of think tanks also set up in the universities to study that region. So you will see more and more people-to-people exchange, because if they want to make this successful investment, they have to.
Charles?
I think I'm going to say that the scale, scope, and imagination of PRC objectives in Pakistan has grown quite a lot over the years. So in the beginning, it seems to me, kind of India-focused and and it's only lately, really, I think that this idea of Pakistan's involvement in a great PRC undertaking to connect itself to all of these has come to the fore, and this business of people-to-people relations. When Eric and I started getting interested in this kind of stuff, I was intrigued by a phenomenon that I call kind of Chinese Orientalism, as distinct from Edward Said Orientalism, and the if you like, the characterization of Islam and Muslims in the Western world is more or less the same in China, only more so. All right? No. Islam as a creed is very hard to, at least in the West, it can be said to derive from Western religious teachings. No such, the traditional Chinese statecraft, which is anti-religious and anti-superstition and all the rest of these things, finding this increasingly hard and very, very difficult to understand, to fathom, much harder. It doesn't go on like this, but the study of the Near East and Islam is well established in the Western world, in the European world. Been chairs of it for a long time in Oxford and Germany, and to a lesser extent France, and still, what it reduces to, especially in the popular mind, this is all unfathomable, it's unreasonable, these people are crazy, you can't deal with them, and it's only more so, with due allowance of my friend Lianchao, it's with the overlay of traditional Chinese, racism, haughtyism, and sort of looking down on everybody and everything. And so I think this is an enormously complicating factor at every level. And we're happy to see the rise of Islamic studies in China, but that hasn't made much of an impression at all, I would think.
Thank you. Time for one more question. Ma'am.
Remember, you ask one question, you get 4 answers. So
Hi, I'm Juliet, and I'm an intern here, and I just had a few questions about what China has prepared, I guess, for a backup plan. So that's really laid back terminology, I apologize, but let's just say that Pakistan does eventually start to fall out of favor with the Chinese ideas and become uncomfortable with them, and their strategy? And what are they planning to do about the way India feels about their project?
Thanks.
I don't know what the backup plan really is.
I mean, I think the problem may not be that Pakistan may not do what China wants in the economic arena, but that Pakistan may be incapable of doing certain things that China expects it to do with regard to what Lianchao said, about providing stability, about providing the 10,000 or 12,000 strong force, about helping them sort of, get back some return on investment which they are going to invest in Pakistan. There are a lot. There have been over the years many foreign investors who have wanted to invest in Pakistan, but they've not really been able to get the stable, secure environment where they will get return on investment. And so I think that's where the problem with Pakistan will come, and the rising radicalization of the society, Islamization, the growth of ISIS in the region, and the other groups. I think that may be a bigger problem, and that may mean that Pakistan cannot deliver what China is expecting.
Yeah, I think they also, the CPEC, the plan itself, last year, the whole year, China and Pakistan, arguing about what to do, back and forth. Finally, they materialized this year, but there are lots of issues has not been resolved. Like the railroad, they're still in the stage of like a study, feasibility study stage. So China can easily back up that investment, because all the investment eventually has to be raised by one of this Silk Road fund. So if they didn't get enough, if they don't get enough fund, they say, we don't have enough investors that are interested in this, and they can also back off that way. But I don't think it seems to me they won't press ahead, but which one? They already approved so many, over probably dozen, maybe 15 projects that's already under construction. So I think they're going to push ahead regardless. This is more, as I said, geopolitical than economic only.
Yeah. Charles?
Let me just say briefly, I think it's the case now, let's say the United States these days, and certainly in West Europe, that the feeling is that projects undertaken in the Islamic world don't pan out, or they don't pan out with the ease and facility with which one thought, or that particular game may not be worth the candle. Why one should think that PRC, which is in every way less well equipped to operate in this part of the world than the Western powers are, or the U.S. or the British or anyone else should. I'm going to learn from Lianchao how you say in Mandarin, "boots on the ground." But the first 10,000 guys you need to protect your 46, and so it goes. And I suppose I'm struck by the fact that these enormous schemes and plans and ambitions that PRC has laid out for itself, not only in Africa but in Latin America and in the Near East and so on, seem not to be working out with the ease and comfort which they had thought they might. And there are many examples of this now in Latin America and Africa and in other places. So we just have to see how this develops and what it means to the future of this of the global distribution of influence and power, which I think is what we ought to be interested in.
Yeah.
I just want to add one more point. I read this article from a scholar in China. He said, if we fail, the CPEC fail, it's not a big deal. We learned our lessons. 46 billion is not a big deal. We have 4 trillion, for reserves there.
Well, on that note, we'll see how this evolves. Thank you very much for all of you for being here. And thanks for coming.
Thank you.
We'll revisit this again, I'm sure, before the year's out. So thank you all.